So in this segment, we'll give you a guided tour of the lifecycle process. We'll have in a slide or two walk through each of the steps. So we'll take a slide or two to describe each step in the process, just to set the stage for the following weeks. We will take a lot more time for each of the steps and discuss them in more detail. So as a warning, this is like the disclaimer slide, if you wish. This and the next few lectures present a simplified recipe for medical software design and management that's appropriate for what I think is an introductory class. This is simplified and is meant to illustrate the concepts. In the real world, you need more documentation, more details, but this should help you at least understand the basics of the process. So this is my slight simplification of the lifecycle model from the standard. So, and this is what we're going to try to follow. We're going to do planning, requirements, design, testing, all the way to release. And then we'll talk about risk management at the end of this segment as well. And again, as always, we start with the identification of user needs, and we conclude with the satisfaction of user needs, right? That is our goal, to create something that meets the needs of our user. That is the definition of validation, which is what we need to demonstrate to regulatory agencies at the end. So the first step in the process is identifying the needs of our user. What do our users need? So we have to ask some questions here, and in the next segment, in the next week's lecture, we'll talk in a lot more detail about this. What are they trying to do right now? How are they doing it? What is it they would like to be able to do in addition? How will they be able to do it using your product, our software? And often missed here is when you look at the standards and you look at this documentation, is that we may need to build some prototypes to better identify problems and solutions. So people think that, okay, we're going to talk to them and talk and have focus groups and take notes, and based on that, we'll come up with a design. And that may be, in fact, the case. But often, a prototype can help clarify this issue. So often at this point, we have to stop, create a quick prototype, which is outside the quality system, potentially, just as have a quick and dirty solution, something that we can show so that we can better understand what they need. Often these prototypes come from university research, so somebody built it as part of, say, a PhD thesis, and this gets used to illustrate the concept. But of course, that prototype then has to be abandoned once we use it to understand the process, and then we start from the beginning to develop a clean piece of software under design controls. So to discuss this topic a little bit more, we have a quick segment from Dr. Andinet Ekwenbari from Kidware, who will talk to us about software research prototypes and their value in this process.
That research prototype is useful as a proof of concept. You're trying to figure out if there is a match between the technology that you've developed and also the market. And that's very, very useful because you can take that prototype and then shop it around or show it to different target users and get some good feedback. But now, in terms of the software, you usually, you might not have to start from scratch, but it's going to require a significant rewriting and refactoring. And the reason being, you have to now put together the software testing, specification, requirements, the design controls we just talked about.
And again, what he was referencing in that segment was in response to a question of how does research software become a commercial product? And you're saying, well, you use it as part of the research, the identification of user needs to show that around to see if it solves anybody's problem. But this makes a more fundamental point about the use of prototypes to identify what your users need. The second step is a system requirement specification. What are the things that the system shall do? This is what the requirements are. And they get captured into this document, the system's requirement specification, which is the master plan for this project. And we'll talk a lot more about this next week. It is critical to this is to identify the usage scenario for our system. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But to summarize, a usage scenario is the combination of the user, the use, and the environment, whether external, technological, regulatory, or conventions that are applied in the field. So that is the beginnings of the system requirement specification, the scenario. And as I've done before, we use this game Clue to help illustrate the concept. So in Clue, the solution to the problem, if you remember, this is a murder mystery. We're trying to identify who was the murderer, in which room, and with what weapon. So this is a potential solution. This was Colonel Mustard in the ballroom with a rope. So this helps you understand in many ways what the issues are. So Colonel Mustard is the user. The intended use, of course, is murder. The environment now is the ballroom and the rope and whatever else comes with that as well. And so from this scenario, we go into requirements. So we have functional requirements, what the system needs to be able to do in order to satisfy the user needs. Okay? If I'm a surgeon, I want to navigate, I need to be able to look at images. So displaying images is a functional requirement, something your surgeon needs. And then we have non-functional requirements. These are capabilities that a system must have to do this well. And by that we mean safely, securely, in a manner pleasing to the user, efficiently, etc. These are qualities of the system that sometimes your user will not mention, but that you need to have. And some user needs, and this is where things get interesting, map to more than one requirement, and some requirements satisfy more than one of our users' needs. And we have to be careful to keep track of them. And this becomes a process called traceability, which we'll get to in the next segment. As an aside, there's a lot of writing that's going to happen as part of this design process. And my advice, and this comes also from guidelines from Vogel in one of the books in this field, that you should use simple and direct writing. You must resist the urge to treat this document as act of creative writing. You use simple language, and you remember that many people working in software are not native English speakers. You have to avoid the use of synonyms such as check and confirm. This will confuse the reader. So for example, if in one part of your document you say, should this happen, the software should check. And in a different part, you have said something like, at the end of this process, we need to ask the user to confirm. A software developer will say, well, what does check and what does confirm mean? Now, if you mean the same thing, you pop up a dialog and you say yes or no, then please use confirm or use check throughout. This makes things simpler. Synonyms make writing interesting, but they make technical writing confusing. I always tell students, throw away your thesaurus, just pick one word and use it throughout. And then the final step is that it's important to keep this type of document relatively short, otherwise you will just be skimmed. If you want people to read what you want them to read, then don't write 100 pages, write the minimum you need to write. And then related to this, remember that, and this is true of all science and all scientific writing, our topic is complicated enough, so keep your writing simple. Short sentences, clear sentences. You're not trying to make something interesting here, although it's good if it's well written and interesting, but you want to keep it as simple as possible so it's easy to read, easy to understand, especially by people for whom English is not their native language. That's not their strength necessarily. So after the system's requirements specification, we have the software design document. This is the roadmap for the actual implementation of the software. We'll talk about this in week 7. Whereas the system specification acts as a bridge between management and the senior software designers, the software design acts as a bridge between the senior software designers and the more junior software engineers who will write the code. So this is the picture that I like, drawn by one of the students helping in this class, Anne Melito. The user is over here. The first bridge is the software requirements, and this takes us from the user to the senior software engineers. And this may well have been written by business analysts, managers, the people who met with the users to identify their needs. The software design document is the second bridge here. And this is the bridge from the senior software engineers who now design the software and the people who have to sit in front of a computer and write the code. And so a lot of these documents are bridges by design. Okay, we're building bridges from one step of the process to the other to convey information so that everybody can do their job. What does the structural software design document look like? Again, we'll come back to this in week 7. It consists of an overview of the software and a summary of the significance of the project, why we're doing what we're doing, the inputs and the outputs, and we identify its place in the larger clinical workflow. We have a big picture design, things like workflows and the linkage of these workflows to system requirements. We may have an outline sketch of the user interface here potentially. And then critically, and we'll come back to this again and again, a list of the external dependencies. What libraries from outside are we using? This becomes an important part of software design. Once we have a design for a software, we have to build it. And this is what the regulatory documents called construction, coding, and then verification, making sure that the code works. So construction is the process of implementing the design, and verification is design is ensuring that the software is correctly implemented as designed. And what this does is that it takes verification, that is, it takes the hopefully quantitative evaluation criteria from the requirements, so a requirement should have criteria to evaluate them, and then demonstrate that these are met. This is what verification is. And then after verification, we have validation. Validation ensures that the correct software package was developed. It tests to ensure that the user's needs are met. Not that the software was developed correctly, but that the user's needs are met. That's the final outer loop. And then the life cycle ends with some final steps. The first one is deployment. How do we get the software installed and integrated into our user's environment? What is the training process for the users? And remember, documentation is part of the software. So in medical device software, in medical software, the user training and the user documentation is part of the device. So it's not an incidental thing that gets done later. The risk management for the software, the risk profile for your software is the risk for the solution, the software plus the user. So the user is part of the system. And so how the user is trained and how the documentation is provided to the user is part of the system, and you have to think about it in that way. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that happens after the event. In addition to deployment, we have maintenance. How will the software be updated? And we have to monitor the use of the software to ensure that it's behaving correctly, and we release updates, especially for things like cybersecurity issues in real time. And then finally, there's retirement. How do we ensure patient safety during this phase? How we safeguard information as the software gets retired? And we'll touch on this at the end of week 10 of this class. In this last segment, we'll return to our favorite topic of risk management, and we will see this in every single step of this process. So as a reminder, risk management will go from hazard to sequence of events that may lead to a hazardous situation which may result in harm to the patient. So this is an ongoing support activity. At each step, we identify hazards and we plan for how to eliminate or mitigate the risk they cause. And this is what we'll do over the next few weeks. At the end of each of these sections, we'll say, okay, risk management now. And an important part of this, and an increasingly important part of the story, is we have to do a cybersecurity analysis for each step. And by each step, I mean requirements, design, testing. All of those require an analysis for cybersecurity issues as well as everything else. And we have a short video segment from Mr. Tom Renner from the consulting company Vision 28 to talk about that now.
Plan for cybersecurity when you're planning for your product, to develop for cybersecurity as you're developing your product, and to surveil, post-market surveillance for cybersecurity issues as your product's on the market. So that means having a plan so that you can get started early. As you're thinking about requirements and overall design, you should be thinking about cybersecurity. It then means assessing vulnerabilities at the requirements stage and later, and not just making a list of some imagined threats, but thinking about the architecture and components and what their vulnerabilities might be, performing that analysis and doing testing of those components. You may need to do unit testing of chips or software functional units or software libraries at the low level, the individual component level, or then at subsystem or whole product levels. That would then give you assurance that you had hardened your product against the known vulnerabilities.
And so with that, we conclude this segment of the guided tour of the process. In the next segment, we'll talk about this incredibly very important topic of information transmission, how to make sure that information gets passed along as we go from step to step in the process, and both the informal aspects of this and the more formal aspects in terms of traceability. Thank you.